Okay, thanks to everyone for joining. This is a side event catalyzing nature-based solutions for biodiversity, climate change, and sustainable development through ecosystem restoration. I'm Makiko Yanagiya, Program Coordinator of UN University Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability. UNU has been an official partner of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and the member of the Good Practice Task Force and the Science Task Force. We are very proud to be hosting this event, which will feature great speakers to discuss how to enhance synergies and raise the momentum of ecosystem restoration, considering gaps, challenges, and opportunities. For today's program, we will first hear opening remarks from UNU-IAS, followed by 4 presentations on how to make ecosystem restoration happen from 4 of our most honored speakers. After which we will have time for the presenters to take questions and discussion. Finally, we will have closing remarks from the Secretariat of CBD. We are truly lucky to have such an esteemed group of speakers to talk to us today. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Yume Yamaguchi, the director of UNU-IAS, who will be delivering opening remarks. Professor Yume Yamaguchi, thank you so much. Please have the floor.
And thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. I am honored to open this side event on the topic catalyzing nature-based solution for biodiversity, climate change, and sustainable development through ecosystem restorations. Excellencies, distinguished guests, and colleagues, our failure to tackle climate and biodiversity crisis is holding back progress on multiple SDGs. The evidence related to the land use is alarming. The IPCC estimate the land conversion due to agriculture, forestry, and other land use accounted for about 21% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And IPBES estimate that deforestation and other land degradation cost approximately 10% of the global GDP every year and lost ecosystem services. So if we do not reverse this trend, the crisis will further destroy the Earth's web of life and damage our health, economies, and societies with a disproportionate impact on people in vulnerable situations. On the other hand, if we succeed in restoring the degraded ecosystems, we can reduce emissions by approximately 1/3 of what is needed by 2030, build climate resilience, and move forward a future in harmony with nature. More evidence. Restoring the ecosystem can also create the jobs and economic growth. For example, UNEP estimate that every dollar invested in restoration creates up to $30 in economic benefit. And the World Economic Forum suggests that emerging business opportunities related to nature could create close to 200 million jobs by 2030. Ladies and gentlemen, restoration is a nature-based solution to climate change. Compared to technology-based solution, it is less expensive and brings more co-benefit for biodiversity, ecosystem services, and sustainable development goals. The last COP26 kept the 1.5-degree goal alive, but without restoring degraded land and seascapes and biodiversity, sustainability goals cannot be achieved. In this context, it is my great pleasure to welcome the expert panel from the FAO, the University of Tokyo, and CBD Secretariat to discuss how restoration can bridge climate, biodiversity, and other sustainability goals. The outcome of today's event, together with the entire outcome of the conference, will be highly relevant as the part 2 of COP15 meet in Montreal later this year. The proposed target for the restoration and the goal of net positive biodiversity by 2030 can be a key catalyst for upscaling action on restoration. Yet, as Ms. Anderson of UNEP, Executive Director, emphasized during the fourth meeting of the open-ended working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework in Nairobi, without clearly defined element in its target and clarity on the indicators to measure the progress, the new framework would remain just aspirational. Therefore, we need our academic experts, policymakers, NGO experts, and students present here today and connected online to energize this discussion, which is creating a global movement for ambitious, measurable, and actionable restoration target in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We appreciate the leadership of the government of Japan hosting this event and the generous contribution to support many of the initiatives of the UNU-IAS. We look forward to our continuous cooperation with the CBD, UNFCCC, UNEP, and FAO, and many other partners as a collaborating agency for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Together, we can achieve the critical goals for the biodiversity, climate change, and sustainable development, and create the foundation for realizing society in harmony with nature. I wish you all a fruitful discussion, and thank you very much for your attention. Back to you, Madam Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Professor Yume Yamaguchi, for your convincing and encouraging message. Next in our program, we have 4 presentations that will give some background information on the ecosystem restoration and suggestions to promote ecosystem restoration in the field around the world. We should have some time for questions from the audience to the speakers, which we will take after all of the presentations are finished. For online participants, please put questions in the QA chat. The first of our presentations will be given by Dr. Maiko Nishi, the research fellow of UNU-IAS. Dr. Nishi has been researching landscape approaches from various dimensions at UNU-IAS, and also she's serving as the lead author of the thematic assessment on the transformative change organized by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services called IPSI. Today, she will speak on biodiversity, health, sustainability nexus in socio-ecological production landscapes and seascapes, TEPRUS. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nishi. So thank you so much. Please have a thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share some lessons and also insights we have gained through the case studies on biodiversity, health, and sustainability nexus, which also has some implication for ecosystem restoration and also climate action. So the case study have been collected through the International Partnership for the Satoyama Initiative, IPSI, for which UNU-IAS has been hosting the Secretariat. Today, I'd like to briefly introduce our initiative and also the case study findings. And also I try to draw some implication for policy recommendation to achieve the global goal on biodiversity and sustainability. So first about our initiative and also the partners, Satoyama Initiative is jointly initiated by UNU and also Ministry of the Environment Japan to globally realize the vision of societies in harmony with nature. The key concept of this initiative is the socio-ecological production landscape and seascapes, SEPOS, which are the area where the production activities like agriculture, forestry, fishery, not only support the livelihood and well-being of local communities, but also contribute to the biodiversity conservation and also sustainable provision of ecosystem services. So in order to implement this concept for policy making and also management practices, the International Partnership for the Satoyama Initiative, IPSI, was launched during the 10th Conference of the Party to CBD in 2010. So this is the global platform to promote and the networking and also collaboration on the SEPOS management, contributing to particularly the sustainable use of biodiversity, the second objective of CBD. So starting with the 51 founding member organization, this partnership has continuously grown, now consisting of 292 organizations, including national, local governments, NGO, private sector, academia and research institutions, and also indigenous people and local communities. So these partners are dedicated to working together to foster synergies in implementation so as to collectively achieve the vision of the initiative. So as serving as a secretariat, we have been collecting the case studies on SEPOS management from IPSI members. So now this amounts to more than 250 cases from different parts of the world. So as an effort to share and disseminate the information knowledge on the SEPOS management derived from the case studies, we have been publishing an annual series of book called Satoyama Initiative Thematic Review, SITR. And each volume features certain hot topic related to biodiversity and sustainability. It also synthesized the case study findings to make a policy recommendation to achieve the related global goals. So the 7th volume of this book series focused on biodiversity, health, and sustainability nexus in SEPOS. We chose this topic in consideration of the global call for integrated solution for sustainability and also rising health concern under the pandemic. So as we know, our 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development emphasize the indivisible nature of all the goals and also highlighting the need for integrated solution to balance all the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. In particular, target 7014 is to enhance policy coherence to address systemic challenges. And also, as we have been discussing throughout this conference, IPCC special report also highlight the needs for transformative systemic change integrated with sustainable development in order to better limit the global warming. And also the parties to CBD adopted the Kunming Declaration last year toward the development of post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Also, this emphasized urgent and integrated action to be done for transformative change that can be made through policy coherence across different levels and also societies and also the scales. In particular, in order to address the increasing threats interlinking to the humans, animals, ecosystems, the concept of One Health has regained the global attention. Particularly under the COVID-19, the new comprehensive definition of One Health was developed by the One Health high-level expert panel, quadripartite collaboration between different international organizations. And with this joint plan of action is being now finalized to operationalize nexus approaches across different sectors for better well-being and health outcomes. So the nexus thinking has been evolving as a perspective emphasizing the dynamic interdependencies of different ecosystem components and human uses across spatial scales and also between different components. But despite this increased attention and also conceptual development, practical challenges also remain to meet multiple goals for sustainability. So in this context, we have selected 11 cases from IPSI partners to learn about how the CEPOS management practicing nexus approaches on the ground can contribute to more sustainable management of natural resources and also help achieve the global goals for biodiversity and sustainability, and also achieve good health for all population and also ecosystems. And each case study addressed common questions like related to multiple benefits from CEPOS and trade-off and synergies between different efforts in managing CEPOS, and also methodology and methods to measure the effectiveness of CEPOS management. And finally, the challenges and opportunities in practicing nexus approaches in order to achieve the global goal. So to learn from each other and also synthesize the case study findings, we organized an online workshop last year by convening case study authors. So our synthesis of the case study findings also revealed that trade-offs are inevitable and inherent challenge in CEPOS management due to its multiplicity to achieve the multiple goals or objectives within the landscape and seascapes. The trade-offs cut across sectors, scales, and levels, and manifested between different ecosystem services, different stakeholder groups, and also different human well-being components, also including material, relational, and subjective dimensions. And most importantly, these trade-offs are political and also gendered because of the different political economic powers among the stakeholders. For example, the one case from Wayanad district in Kerala, India, showed the cascading effects of ecosystem change in paddy wetlands. So in order to increase the agricultural productivity and profitability, rice paddies were converted to banana plantation. Despite the economic gain by those running the plantation, this also led to the reduced wetland capacity, including rainwater storage and also aquifer recharging capacity. And this also made some negative impacts on ecosystem health through the use of toxic pesticides. And these negative impacts were disproportionately felt by the tribal communities who are relying on the ecosystem for their survival and also their livelihoods, and also particularly vulnerable to climate change. But the CEPOS management also helps to address or minimize the trade-offs and also maximize the synergies by enhancing the local capacity to better access the resources and also benefit from ecosystem functions and also address the climate challenges. For example, one case from Yucatan Peninsula, Mexico, featured the participatory assessment on resilience in an extensive forest milpa landscapes, which also represents some essential and also worldwide carbon reservoir. So under the framework of the country strategy of Jeff Small Grants program, the local community in the region used a comprehensive set of 20 indicators to assess the resilience in the landscapes, particularly with the involvement of 40 local farmers. So they collectively identified human health as the most significant local stress interlinking to agricultural chemicals, water contamination, and also dietary habitat change. So they found that the critical drivers of change derived from outside of the communities, but they also developed local strategies, including sharing of the values of Milpa, like a healthy traditional diets with children for the knowledge transmission on the sustainable use of biodiversity, and also communicating with other people in the local community about the pesticide problems. And also they plan to make alliance with the other stakeholders like NGOs and university to resolve the water contamination problems across the watershed. And also they plan to create some medicine hospitals building on their local knowledge and also traditional medicinal plants to overcome the shortage of health services. So in this way, the local communities are using somehow nexus approaches to resolve their problems and also enhance their health and also human well-being by seeing this carbon reserve at their own territory. So finally, based on the synthesis, we also found some 4 steps to materialize nexus approaches for more concerted and also coordinated efforts to mainstream biodiversity. The first step is to collectively identify nexus hotspots, which are vulnerable area where the trade-offs are established. So this could be made through the co-production of knowledge among different stakeholders who can learn from each other and also bring together different resources and also develop their own capacity for more sound decision and action. The second is to ensure multiple dimensions of human well-being of local communities, and particularly to safeguard the economic viability of intervention, so that those dependent on the ecosystem can be motivated and also engage the conservation management practices in the long run. And the third is to strengthen community-based institutions and take phased and adaptive approaches to mainstream such local institutions. And here, the government authority can play an important role in enhancing policy coherence and also putting in place a fair and equitable mechanism for incentive creation and also benefit sharing. But the policy needs to be informed by other stakeholders, particularly including the local communities where the nexus approaches are practiced on the ground. The final step is to contextualize globally accepted framework by reflecting the community needs and also local adaptability. And here it is important to engage in the whole of society approach to facilitate a more participatory and increasing approach to entire planning cycle, so that we can ensure the contextual richness of policy making and implementation. But also at the same time, we can also speak to the higher level policy forum to achieve the global goals. So these policy recommendations are also available in the policy brief available on the website. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge all the contribution and inputs from colleagues, particularly the case study authors. And the book is now available, published as an open access book from Springer. And thank you very much for your attention. So our information is also available on the website, accessible from this QR code. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your very comprehensive and informative presentation. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Shizuka Hashimoto from the Department of Ecosystem Studies, School of Agricultural and Life Sciences, the University of Tokyo. He has more than 10 years of experience in ecosystem service evaluation and its application in rural and landscape planning. Dr. Hashimoto also acquired extensive experiences in statistical modeling, land change, and ecosystem service simulation, and the scenario analysis. He contributed the IPBES Global Assessment and the Asia Pacific Regional Assessment as a lead author. Since 2018, he has served as one of the multidisciplinary expert panel members of IPBES. He was also selected as the expert of the IP-based IPCC co-sponsored workshop on biodiversity and climate change. Today, he will give a presentation on climate and biodiversity synergy and trade-off. So please welcome Dr. Hashimoto. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm Shizuka Hashimoto from the University of Tokyo. So I'm here to introduce some of the key findings of IPCC co-sponsored workshop, as well as IPBES global assessment, especially focusing on climate change and biodiversity nexus, their synergies and trade-offs. Before I introduce their interdependencies, let me quickly introduce the expansion of human activities and environmental consequences in the past 250 years. So this slide shows you 24 different graphs. On left, 12 graphs shows different human activities, including population growth and increased dam constructions and water uses. The horizontal axis represent the timeline starting from 1750 to 2000. And the vertical axis shows the changes in the each variables. So population increase continuously, especially after, from early 20th centuries, the growth rate increased rapidly. And this result in the rapid expansion of the dam and water use to feed humanities. We use quite lots of fertilizers to produce more agricultural produce. But these human activities, expansions, resulted in our wealthier Reich, but also had a negative consequences. This resulted in the massive concentration of the atmospheric concentration of the greenhouse gas emissions, as well as, the negative impact on the biodiversity, such as overfishing and coastal nitrogen loss increased dramatically, and a species extinction rate also increased in the past 250 years. According to the IPBES global assessment report, the biodiversity decline, major drivers of the biodiversity decline include land use change and sea use change and the direct exploitations. This includes the fishing and the timber harvesting, and climate change and pollution due to agrochemicals and other chemicals and endangered species. And their impacts can vary from ecosystem to ecosystems, but climate change are recognized as one of the important direct drivers, and this is expected to increase their impact and also into the future. And this will have a negative impact on the biodiversity in combination with other direct drivers of changes. So, the advancement of the climate change could have negative impacts on the biodiversity. And a biodiversity that has a capacity to mitigate the climate change or will help us adapt to the climate change. For the mitigations, for example, the forest can serve as a massive sink of greenhouse gas emissions to mitigate climate change. And green areas along the coast will have some positive impact to reduce the impact of the climate, the extreme weathers. So in this way, biodiversity provides us a lot of opportunities to reduce the impacts and adapt to the climate change. So solving the climate change requires the conservation of biodiversity and vice versa. So we have to think about both aspects, not only the climate change, but also the biodiversity conservation should be considered, even if we take measures for climate change. And one of the striking evidence presented by the IPBES global assessment was that meeting climate target will not necessarily halt the biodiversity decline. So this slide, it's a bit difficult to capture, but this slide shows the consequences on the biodiversity and the provisioning services and regulating services under 3 distinct socioeconomic scenarios, namely sustainable, global sustainability, regional competitions, and economic optimisms. These are the combination of different SSPs and LCP scenarios, which are often used to explore socioeconomic consequences of the climate changes. And among these 3 scenarios, global sustainability scenario, which is a combination of SSP1 and LCP 2.6, is known as one of the most sustainable scenarios in terms of the climate mitigations, because it is designed to meet the 2.0 degree climate target. However, this modeling exercise also presented that even under global sustainability scenarios, well, the biodiversity and the regulating services will decline into the future across different regions. This is very striking evidence that we have to keep in mind. So meeting climate change not necessarily help us to achieve the climate target, the biodiversity target. So we have to be a bit careful. According to the recent workshop report jointly produced by IPSI and IPSI, measures that focus only on climate change mitigations may have negative effect on biodiversities. This figure shows how the effect of actions to mitigate climate change on actions to mitigate biodiversity loss. So climate change is located on the left side of this figure, and a biodiversity action is located on the right hand of this figure. And if they have a positive effect, so for example, climate change actions, climate mitigation actions has positive consequences on the biodiversity conservations. They're connected with blue lines. If they're connected with red lines, this implies that they have a trade-off effect. So even it has a positive effect on climate mitigations, it has negative consequences on biodiversity conservations. And this report indicated that there are many climate measures that could have unexpected negative impacts. This includes large-scale monoculture of trees and bioenergy crops that is actually taking place in many parts of the world, and planting trees in ecosystems that were not originally forests. But this could be useful as the planting trees can serve as a massive sink of the carbon. And reforestation with non-native tree species also have a negative effect on the biodiversity. And recent expansion of the renewable energy productions, like the installation of wind power, hydroelectric power, and mega solar power plants, also has a negative impact if we don't care, well, take into considerations their biodiversity consequences. Also, mining of resources for renewable energy technologies could have a negative impact on the biodiversity. Those are actually some of the areas that have unexpected negative impacts on biodiversity. On the other hand, this report also indicated that many biodiversity conservation measures are compatible with climate change measures. So this includes the protected area expansions and ecosystem management for conservation purposes, and also reduce the per capita consumption, dietary changes, and sustainable use of natural resources having a negative, having a positive impact both on biodiversity and climate change. And one of the key measures that can produce co-benefit for climate change and biodiversity is the use of the nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions is a kind of the umbrella term that covers nature restoration, protected areas, green infrastructures, ecosystem-based mitigation and adaptations, ecosystem-based disaster risk reductions, and integrated management of ecosystems, and so on. So this is quite a broad concept, but if this is employed in an effective manner, this can have can produce a co-benefit for climate mitigations and adaptation, and as well as biodiversity conservations. So nature-based solutions can be effective if it is implemented through long-term and systematic approaches in combination with an ambitious reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we are not successful in reducing the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions reductions, the impact or the positive effect arising from the implementation of the nature-based solutions can also decrease. So that is one of the things we have to keep in our mind when we discuss nature-based solutions. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hashimoto, for your very insightful presentation. Your message is very important for the Synergy Conference. Thank you so much. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Andrea Romero. She's a Colombian forest engineer with a Master in Science in Forest and Nature Conservation from UNU University. As a partner of her master's, she conducted research in Brazil on fire ecology in a collaborative project with the University of Brasilia. From 2020, she joined FAO to support the working of the Untitled Ecosystem Restoration Task Force on best practices regarding knowledge dissemination and capacity development for ecosystem restoration at a global level. Today, she joined the workshop online and is explaining about the overall picture of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, including activities under the Best Practice Task Force. So please welcome Ms. Andrea Romero. Andrea, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Do you see my screen?
I can see you, but the volume of the Bruno, could you check it?
She's speaking from here. Can you speak again, Andrea?
Yes, yeah, I'm here. Do you hear me well?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Now, could you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here to give you an overview of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, 2021 to 2030, especially regarding the role of the FAO-led Task Force on Best Practices on enhancing capacities for effective ecosystem restoration throughout this decade and beyond. So this decade was established to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of ecosystems worldwide. So in March 2019, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the resolution to declare this decade. And then in September 2020, the strategy and the visual identity were released. And the lead agencies of this decade are FAO and UNEP. For more information, you can visit the website of the decade. So the vision of this decade is a world where, for the health and well-being of all life on Earth and that of future generations, the relationship between humans and nature has been restored, where the area of healthy ecosystems is increasing, and where ecosystem loss, fragmentation, and degradation has been ended. To achieve this vision, some barriers and pathways to overcome those barriers have been identified in the strategy of the decade. So today, because of time limitations, I will not give so many details regarding this strategy, but this strategy is available online on the website of the decade. And regarding the barriers, I will give more details in some minutes. So there is also an action plan for the implementation of this strategy. An initial draft has gone through consultation with the partners network of the decade last year, and this year will go for public consultation. Also, to foster more action on the ground, this year was the UN Decade launched the first call for countries to nominate World Restoration Flagships. And these World Restoration Flagships are considered the first, best, or most promising examples of large-scale and long-term ecosystem restoration, embodying the 10 principles for ecosystem restoration that I will also give you more details, and inspiring others to accelerate their efforts. Very quickly, the criteria for selection of those flagships for this first call was based on country demand and endorsement, the alignment with the 10 principles for ecosystem restoration, the possibility to measure and document the results from these initiatives, the demonstration value, and the significant size or scaling potential. In addition, a multi-partner trust fund was created last year in 2021 by FAO and UNEP with the ambition to raise $100 million by 2030 to support the implementation of this decade and the flagships. 3 outputs have been established for this MPTF, this multi-partner trust fund. The first one, the development of a global movement on ecosystem restoration. The second one, catalyze investments resulting in restoration actions on the ground and regarding the implementations of the flagships initiatives. And the third one is monitoring and reporting on biophysical and socioeconomic elements. So regarding the governance of the decade, for the decade, we have a strategy group. There are the senior decision makers that coordinate the decade from FAO and UNEP. 5 task forces have been established to support the implementation of the decade. There is also a network of partners and an advisory board. All of these, the composition or the details of these are published on the UN Decade website, but today I want to be focused on the role of the task forces, especially one, but so to give you an overview, 5 task forces have been established, as I mentioned. The first one is the task force on monitoring led by FAO. The second one is the task force on best practices, also led by FAO. There is another task force, that is a science task force led by IUCN. We also have the finance task force led by the World Bank. And finally, we have the youth task force facilitated by the United Nations Mayor Group for Children and Youth. And today, I'm here to give you a summary of the main activities, achievements, and ongoing activities of this task force on best practices led by FAO. So, as I mentioned in the first slides, several barriers have been identified to achieve the vision of the UN Decade. Among them, we have political will, public awareness, legislative and policy environments, finance, scientific research, and technical capacity. So especially to address this barrier or this low technical capacity to plan, design, monitor, and sustain restoration efforts, the Task Force on Best Practices was established. So this task force is a collaborative effort on knowledge dissemination and capacity development. Today we have 258 members from 110 different global leading organizations in the field of knowledge dissemination, but also organizations undertaking restoration on the ground. The work of the task force is developed around 7 outputs. So the first 4 outputs we have already, because the task force was established in 2020, so we have been working on these first outputs regarding the operationalization of the task force, prioritization of ecosystems, identification of key resource partners, and a capacity needs assessment to identify gaps of capacity to undertake effective ecosystem restoration. So based on this, currently we are focused on the last 3 outputs, developing a capacity, knowledge, and learning action plan, drafting TORs, or terms of reference, for the decade flagship products derived from this knowledge and learning action plan, and on the dissemination on good practices. So for them, currently the main achievements of the task force, besides the outputs, the description of the outputs that I just provide, we have 2 publications. The first one is the Principles for Ecosystem Restoration to Guide the UN Decade. As I mentioned, these principles have been used to as the main criteria to assess the nominations for flagships, of world restoration flagships. So this publication presents 10 principles applicable across all sectors, biomes, and regions. It's currently freely available online on the website of the decade, but also the website of FEO. And we are currently working on the translations of this publication. It's currently available in Spanish, and soon will be available in French, Arabic, and Chinese, and later in Russian. And the second publication is the Global Capacity Needs Assessment, as I presented also in the previous slide. We conducted this Global Capacity Needs Assessment through an online global survey disseminated in 7 languages. We received 1,331 responses, and this assessment allows us to identify key gaps and capacity priorities for restoration to support the UN decade. The summary report of the results of this assessment is published online as well, and is freely available on the UN decade website. Also, I forgot to mention that these principles, the 10 principles for ecosystem restoration, were developed in partnership with IUCN CEM and the Society for Ecological Restoration, and collaboratively with UNEP, C4ECRAFT, WWF, and EcoHealth Network. So very quickly, regarding these principles for ecosystem restoration, we have 10 principles. I will give you the main details of each one. The first one, ecosystem restoration, contributes to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the goals of the Rio Conventions. Principle 2 is about ecosystem restoration, promotes inclusive and participatory governance, so promotes broad engagement of stakeholders and right holders directly or indirectly affected by restoration. Principle 3, ecosystem restoration, includes a continuum of restorative activities, so many types of activities are part of ecosystem restoration. Principle 4 is about ecosystem restoration and to achieve the highest level of recovery possible for biodiversity, ecosystem health and integrity, and human well-being, so basically nature and people. And principle 5, ecosystem restoration addresses the causes of ecosystem degradation, the direct and indirect causes of ecosystem degradation. Principle 6, ecosystem restoration incorporates all types of knowledge and promotes their change and integration throughout the process. Principle 7, ecosystem restoration should have measurable and well-defined goals in the short, medium, and long term about ecological, cultural, and socioeconomic aspects. Principle 8, ecosystem restoration is tailored to the local ecological, cultural, and socioeconomic context while considering the larger landscape or seascape. And principle 9, ecosystem restoration includes monitoring, evaluation, and adaptive management throughout and beyond the lifetime of the project or program. And finally, principle 10 is about ecosystem restoration is enabled by policies and measures. So ecosystem restoration promotes policy integration, identifies the policy that support the process. So regarding the second achievement, that is the Global Capacity Needs Assessment, as I told you, we published this summary report. So just I would like to mention that when we conducting this global survey, this global capacity needs assessment last year, within the survey, we tailor different questions to different stakeholder groups. So we have specific questions for these 5 stakeholder groups. The first one, governments, NGOs, and others, and international and national level. The second one, governments, NGOs, and community-based organizations, and subnational and local level. The third group was research and education. The fourth one, investors, donors, private sector, and others. And the last one, land users, communities and interest groups. So most of our respondents came from governments, NGOs, and others at international and national level, and with a similar representation from groups 2, 3, and 5, and with a small representation from investors, donors, and private sector. So based on this, we identified key areas or key priority areas for capacity development to develop capacities at, we always talk about system-wide capacities, so capacities of individuals, organizations, and the enabling environment. So these key priority areas that you will find more details in the report are financing, stakeholder engagement, technical knowledge, technical capacities, and policy. And currently, this year, after the achievement and the publication of these 2 documents, the task force is working on 3 main packages. The first one is the standards of practice for ecosystem restoration. So this is a publication that we are planning to launch on the occasion of the CBD COP 15 December this year. This publication is based on the 10 principles for ecosystem restoration. So the standards of practice are aimed to provide guidance on the implementation of these 10 principles for ecosystem restoration to facilitate their application. And is based on a stock-taking effort of existing standards of practice. And we soon, I think next month, we will conduct a global consultation, also some sort of targeted consultations on the first draft that we are currently finalizing. The second package is the capacity, knowledge, and learning action plan, also to be launched this year, by the end of this year, at the CBD COP 15. And this action plan is based or is building on the gaps identified through the capacity needs assessment, the report, and the global survey that I just mentioned. So really, what are the actions to address those gaps? And it's also based on stock taking of existing knowledge products and capacity development initiatives. So we don't want to duplicate efforts. We want to build on what is already existing that we can tap and use or very disseminate. And for this, we will also conduct some global targeted consultations. So for these 2 products, I will invite you to participate through these global consultations. These consultations will be advertised on the UNDECET website. And finally, the third package is the framework for disseminating good practices. This framework will be launched in September this year in the occasion of the FAO GLF Digital Forum in the 29th of September. And for this, we are developing a template for systematic documentation of good practices derived from restoration projects, aligned with the 10 principles for ecosystem restoration. So the template and the platform for documentation and dissemination is what we are currently developing. And also with other platforms as WOCAD, Panorama Solutions, and others, which are platforms that are already also documenting good practices. So we want to collaborate with them. We want to facilitate the access to their practices so that we have like a network of platforms providing good practices. So this will be also hosted, the whole all the platforms and the good practices from these platforms, are also the practices that will be collected by the task force of best practices, will be hosted on the UNDECET website. So to this, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for introducing the education on ecosystem restoration. there's a lot of possibilities in the program of ecosystem restoration. We really appreciate your great efforts in promoting the UNDK. Thank you so much. The last of our presentations today will be given by Dr. David Obra, our founding director of Cordio East Africa, a knowledge organization supporting sustainability of coral reef and marine systems in the Western Indian Ocean. At the boundary between science and action, David works to integrate conservation and development through inclusive blue economy principles and the links provided by global sustainability goals and targets. He is the co-chair of IPSI Nexus Assessment and the coordinating lead author of IPSI Global Assessment and taking many other important roles at the biodiversity-related international arena. Unfortunately, he could not join the conference today because he is joining the IPAC in Uganda now, but he kindly sent us the recorded video. He will give a presentation on suggestive outputs from the new science brief from GeoBond, which was launched last month.
Good day. My name is David Obura. I'm the director of Cordio East Africa, and it's my pleasure to be speaking to you from the Africa Protected Areas Congress in Kigali, in Rwanda, which is why I can't be present in person. But I've been asked to speak about the role of restoration in the context of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And I'm doing this from the perspective of having participated in the science inputs to the CBD in the open working process, first in 2020 through 2021, with the science brief submitted towards the Geneva Open Working Group. And then policy science briefs also focused on individual targets, which we prepared for the Nairobi session. Now I'll focus on ecosystem area integrity, as these are the essential components of Goal A that we have focused on, and the importance of actions to halt nature's decline and actively restore it are essential for Goal A. The targets 1, 2, and 3 are area-based targets, and they're complementary to one another in delivering on Goal A. Target 1 is on spatial planning across landscape and seascape mosaics to 100% of national territory, but also with the second clause focused on preventing further losses, particularly of critical and vulnerable ecosystems. Target 2 on restoration is a new target from the IPSI targets previously. This focuses not just on restoring biodiversity, but also on productivity and function, which I'll explore more in the next slide. And then target 3 is on protected and conserved areas, and this is the inheritor of IPSI target 11 to increase the protected area state. Now on restoration, a critical item here is that to increase area of natural ecosystems, one must restore transformed or degraded transformed ecosystems in the bottom in orange, following those green arrows to natural ecosystem state. But there are other restoration actions that can, in the orange arrows, that can take degraded systems and restore them, so degraded natural systems to an improved state, and also degraded transformed ecosystems to a better functioning state. And these could also be the focus of restoration, but they're not the focus under target 2, the way it is currently worded. Now, what we did in the science brief on these area-based targets is really try to put them in the context of the global situation or the overall situation in the country, and so that the targets really dealt with together rather than isolation. So, for example, this is the average state of a country in 2020 at the end of the IPSI biodiversity targets, and now in 2022 as we come towards adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And these are the proportions, global proportions of the state of nature and protection. So there's a number of papers that show that the proportion of natural ecosystems or intact natural and functioning ecosystems is about 50% of total terrestrial ice-free area. So it also means that managed ecosystems, which are under production, whether for farming or urbanization, other uses, are about 50% as well. The protected and conserved areas under target 3, or this was under the IPSI target 11, stood at 17% in 2020, of total terrestrial area. And then there's this proportion of land area that is considered degraded. This is a very challenging proportion to calculate because definitions of what is degraded vary from one system to another and one ecosystem to another. But we came up with this as basically a third of the total managed estate could be considered degraded or worthy of having some restoration. But that degraded area might be spread across natural areas as well. So we've indicated it as the grey shaded area to the left. And in thinking of of the implications of the new Global Biodiversity Framework targets for action in the country and how space in the country might be allocated coming up to 2030, we show this middle figure. So if we achieve goal A, that's the intent, the area of natural ecosystems is planned to increase by 5%, so it's slightly larger than the one on the left, which you can just see in this figure. More visible, of course, is the increase in protected and conserved areas to 30%, and these might spread across much more of the natural ecosystem estate of the country. And it's very important to remember here that a lot of this can be done in conjunction with sustainable use, with traditional uses, because these areas are already in a natural state. So this is more a matter of ensuring that loss is prevented than fully changing activities that are happening in those areas to know. And then in that degraded area, there's an ambition to restore, in blue there, an active restoration might be spread across the terrestrial area as indicated. So we show here that spatial planning occurs over 100% of the territory under Target 1. We also prevent and minimize losses of ecosystems, Target 1B with labeled as. And then the increase in restoration. And then I'll mention this further in the next slide, but after a lot of thought about this, because of the challenges of dealing with a percentage restoration target with various parties and observers have come up with recommendations for a fixed area target to be stated. Then the increase in protected areas under Target 3 and sustainable management to manage lands under Target 10. Now, how much area needs to be restored? This is the big question. And we followed up with a simple calculation over here that the amount of or the net gain for goal A of natural ecosystem area reflects the balance between the restoration of the positives and the losses of the negatives. This needs to be considered in terms of land over ice-free land area. So that's in the denominator of this equation here. And the fraction of total land area is considered natural, which, as I said earlier, is about 50%. Now, to estimate what is needed to be done to achieve that 5% net gain. So in the green box there, you can see we have a global natural area, divided by 2, 50%. There are ongoing losses in nature currently, and under Targets 1 and Target 3, actions to reduce losses are essential, and we estimate here to be ambitious that losses are reduced by 75% by 2030. And then in order to achieve that 5% gain on the right, this would require restoration of 400 million hectares of terrestrial area to be under restoration. And if this equation balances out to achieve that 5% gain. Now this is a back of the envelope calculation just to help parties and observers to understand the ambition that is needed. We can play out this 2030 scenario to 2050 for the 15% net gain, which is the ambition under goal A in the green box on the right. And in the red boxes below, if we follow business as usual scenarios of continued losses at the same levels as they are today through to 2030 and 2050, and much less ambitious restoration. So that half of the bond challenge on the left there is the proportion of the bond challenge that would restore degraded forests from plantation to a natural state. And the other half of the bond challenge would improve the integrity of plantation forests and so on, but would not make them natural. But that would result in just under 1% net loss in natural area by 2030. And just extending that out to 2050, we end up with minus 2.5% or 2.5% net loss in that area. Now, there's a number of assumptions in these calculations, of course, but they do help to show the amount of ambition is needed. That 400 million hectares under restoration by 2030 is essential to achieve goal 8. So just to wrap up here, so objectives for restoration: increasing the area and integrity of natural systems to support biodiversity conservation, but also to enhance nature's contributions to people of all types across all scales. 2030 targets that I've already mentioned to minimize losses. This 400 million figure that is representative for terrestrial habitats, but we haven't made these calculations. And then for priority ecosystems, of course, will be the most important to include in that 400 million hectares. But we don't know the levels for freshwater and marine yet. And there is now strong guidance in the literature that coming out of these large protected areas and large intact areas to inhabited landscapes, if we can achieve 20% of intact habitat per square kilometer in these farmed and managed ecosystems, this can really help support farming and other biodiversity use, nature's contributions to people across managed systems as well. So the final word I'd like to put forward is that to consider this, especially in achieving this conversion from altered and managed systems to natural, that a large part of this 400 million hectares of restoration could happen at small scales in managed and farmed habitats to increase functions and nature's contributions to people in these areas so that people benefit. But at the same time, of course, this provides stepping stone habitats and corridors across these mosaic land and seascapes, which will really help biodiversity to recover as well. So with that, I say thank you.
Sorry for the trouble on the video sound. We finished the presentation session. Please give a big hand to all the presenters again. Now we are having discussion session. So Hashimoto Sensei and Michael, could you please come to the stage again? And Andrea, could you turn on the video? This discussion session is moderated by my colleague, Dr. Bruno Leles. So please, Bruno, over to you.
Thank you. I'm sorry for the technical problems we had, so we are a little bit behind schedule. But it's a pleasure to be here with this outstanding panel of experts to dive a little bit deeper into very important issues for restoration and how to use restoration to bring together the biodiversity, the climate change, and the SDG agenda. So I would like to start with a question to Dr. Nishi about the restoration of degraded landscapes and seascapes can have multiple benefits, as we saw from your presentation and also from the other presentations as well. And the Satoyama Initiative recently published the book about the biodiversity, health, and sustainability nexus. And I know that the Satoyama Initiative is developing a system restoration. So how do you think these synergies among the different dimensions of biodiversity, climate, health, and the SDGs can be better explored by restoration initiatives? And what are the main lessons that you have from the experience with IPSI partners?
Thank you very much. A very kind of encompassing kind of question. As kind of you kindly introduced, we have been now working of the ecosystem restoration in the context of CEPOS management. So I think we are now drawing some key messages from the synthesis, like we had also workshop last month. And some of the key message we are having is to, of course, we need some resources and capacity to make some change in the trajectories to kind of have some interaction with nature. And so, but I think we have also kind of good resources on the ground. But at the same time, we need to work together to bring in some new resources. I think for capacity development, as also Andrea also introduced, is a very critical component, I think. And so like our coordination is also very much important because also as Professor Hashimoto mentions, there are kind of trade-offs and also synergies. So we can't really resolve all the kind of challenges within the only the landscape or seascape scale. We need to also work together with other experts and also other stakeholders, because some kind of policy, particularly looking at the certain landscape or seascape, cannot resolve. So the impacts also kind of go beyond the landscape and seascape. In a way, I think we need to have some coordination and consultation and also collaboration across different scale. And also some financial sustainability is also a critical component. We are building on some local actions, but also
Excellent, excellent. And then I would like to move to another question from our audience online, from Albrecht Arevaldo. So Albrecht is asking, and I think that Andrea, you will be able to answer his question, that Alfred is asking, how do we ensure that NBS efforts are not subjected to greenwashing? And you presented the principles for the restoration initiatives. And I think that we can understand here as NBS as restoration as one type of NBS. So how do you think that these documents developed by FAO can help minimize the risk of having a greenwash for restoration initiatives?
Yes, thank you, Bruno. Indeed, this is an issue that is addressed in the introduction of the publication of the principles for ecosystem restoration. And in this introduction, we say, or it is stated that yeah, it is important to mention all the benefits that ecosystem restoration provides as a nature-based solution in terms of biodiversity, climate change, mitigation, and many other benefits for nature and people. But we, in the principles, it is always emphasized that ecosystem restoration cannot be a substitute for conservation, and nor for a rapid and deep decarbonization of the world's economy. So this a distinction that should be provided clearly for practitioners and for everyone involved in restoration. That is not like you are compensating the unsustainable use of natural resources. So the detoxifying and decarbonizing the economy, the economic activity is really a priority that should be developed in parallel with ecosystem restoration.
Excellent, thank you very much. And then moving on, Professor Hashimoto, David unfortunately couldn't join the panel today, but he presented some scenarios about future possibilities regarding, depending on how we are going to address restoration. So scenarios and models are powerful tools to analyze the outcome of alternative decisions and inform policymaking. And this approach has been explored by IPCC with scenarios that predict greenhouse gas emissions and their impact on global temperature. So creating scenarios for restoration, as David presented, will be very important moving forward for us to understand which areas we should prioritize for restoring And then what are the consequences of our decisions in terms of where and how we are going to implement restoration projects. However, most scenarios of biodiversity and ecosystem services have important shortcomings, especially related to assessing only a few dimensions of biodiversity. So biodiversity is a very complex theme, and also only a few dimensions of nature contributions to people. So how do you think that scenarios framework can be improved to better support restoration action and inform the outcome of these different pathways that we can undertake during this decade?
Thank you for raising the very important questions. Well, actually, according to my understanding about the current challenges regarding the global scenario is that most of the global scenarios, well, most of the environmental scenarios available at global scales are climate-centered. So as I introduced in my presentations, SSPs and RCPs are very, very useful tools to explore the implications of our development pathways and how we can achieve the climate target. But the important limitations highlighted by the IPSI global assessment was that those climate scenarios, including both SSPs and RCPs, didn't consider a lot about their impacts on the biodiversity. And lots of scientists at global scale are trying to improve the quality of the SSPs in light of the biodiversity conservations. So that is now, well, actually recently started. So SSP communities and RCP communities are invited to work together with global biodiversity scientists to critically discuss and improve the current, the assumptions embedded in the global scenarios. And another important challenge is that we need a different framework to help the policymakers and scientists to frame the future global biodiversity target. So SSPs and RCP can continue to be a very important instrument for the future projections and to assess their implications on the global biodiversity. But we also need some new scenarios framework and new scenarios that are built or that considers the nature as a central topic. So within IPSI, we have the task force on scenario models, and they actually, after their methodological assessment of scenario models, which was published in 2016, one of the important gap identified this methodological assessment report was lack of biodiversity-centered or nature-centered scenarios. So now, actually, the IPSI plenary organized in Bonn 2 weeks ago. The member states approved a new scenario framework, which is called the Nature Futures Framework, as a basic instrument to create nature-centered scenarios to help achieve the global biodiversity target. So I believe this new development of the new Nature's Futures Scenarios framework will help scientists and the government or the stakeholders can better address important global biodiversity issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think that this topic of scenarios will be a very important one going forward. So in the interest of time, I think we'll have to close here, unfortunately. But thank you so much for this insightful discussion. And I hope that it can help our attendance also to understand a little bit better the implications of restoration and the science behind it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much, Bruno, and thank you for the Hashimoto Sensei and Maiko-san. To conclude this event, I am honored to introduce Mr. Wataru Suzuki, the Global Coordinator at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. He will help us wrap up and make some more sense of all the great information we have heard today. Mr. Suzuki, over to you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for kind introduction. First of all, I would like to express my sincere appreciation for Director Professor Yume Yamaguchi and colleagues of United Nations University Institute of Advanced Study of Sustainability for organizing this timely and very relevant event, and to distinguished speakers for your inspiring and informative presentations. I would like to make brief closing remarks on behalf of the Secretariat on Convention on Biological Diversity. Ecosystem restoration is an effective, affordable, and long-lasting nature-based solution for biodiversity conservation, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and social security. We are seeing the policy and operational momentum building for its implementation under the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. It is estimated that between 20 to 40% of the total land surface is degraded. Current global commitments for land and ecosystem restoration are about 1 billion hectares. According to the UNCCD Global Land Outlook 2, this level of commitment, even if achieved, will not help bring us to a safe trajectory where we can stabilize climate change and halt biodiversity loss. Restoring 15% of degraded ecosystems was one of the Aichi biodiversity targets that was only partially achieved due to various reasons. Yet, to support developing countries in planning and implementing restoration activities, the CBD Secretariat is implementing the Forest Ecosystem Restoration Initiative, or FLAGSHIPS, with financial support from the Republic of Korea. In the framework of FLAGSHIPS, a massive open online course on ecosystem restoration will run from September to November this year. Dear participants, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, or GBF, under negotiation recognizes area-based restoration as one of the important elements of biodiversity conservation and protection alongside integrated land and seascape planning, conservation, and other effective area-based conservation measures. We must mobilize existing efforts such as FUELI and the Satoyama initiative, as well as new and additional initiative for restoration. Last month, the fourth meeting of the open-ended working group resumed negotiation of the GBF, including its draft area-based action target 1 on retaining wilderness areas, 2 on restoration, and 3 on protection and conservation. Despite limited progress in finalizing these targets, the main elements important for countries are clear. Without prejudging the negotiations outcomes, under Target 2 on restoration, we can highlight some of the draft elements being negotiated. We see different levels of restoration ambition: 20%, 30%, or 1 billion hectares of global area or degraded ecosystems. A baseline level possibly defined as a natural state, nationally identified priority areas for restoration to include ecosystem integrity and connectivity, and last but not least, the critical importance of the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples and local communities. The draft of targets 1, 2, and 3, together with other GBF targets, will contribute to the attainment of the goal A to enhance the integrity of all ecosystems with an increase of at least 15% in the area connectivity and integrity of natural ecosystems. To help resolving differences on elements of the GBF, a regionally balanced informal group of party representatives will be convened in a meeting in September. The open-ended working group will resume its work in a 5th meeting held in Montreal at the beginning of December. The CBD COP15 in Montreal in December will then finalize and adapt the GBF, including action targets and their headline indicators. It is encouraging to see strong interest and willingness for the implementation of the GBF, including new and additional pledges by China, Japan, and other countries at the first part of CBD COP15. In closing, well-coordinated and synergetic actions will be needed by all stakeholders, scientific community, donors, and international agencies, and indigenous peoples and local communities, youth, and for gender considerations to support implementation of the GBF through lessons learned from the IT targets, as well as best available data, knowledge, and technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Suzuki, for giving us the warm words of encouragement toward the CBD COP15. Well, this is the end of this session. I thank you very much again, all of you here and online participants. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.